Manny Masih.
BBC Radio Gloucestershire.
Now, let's have a look at this simple question I don't understand. A solution to racial bias in the workplace. That could be the answer. I don't understand. One expert on the issue thinks so. Having spoken to 40,000 people over the past 20 years, Buki Mosaku, who has written a book about how widespread unconscious bias is within modern life, and now to address it.
What I found was that the general approach to this was more focused around trying to create a better environment for people to work in, and not enough attention was focused around allocated to equipping people to navigate what I describe as the inevitability of unconscious workplace bias. So with that in mind, it put me on a quest to try and find out how we can equip people with strategies and skills to navigate the inevitability of unconscious bias in the workplace and the bias that leads to underrepresentation of minorities.
I'm just sort of thinking that it's going to be difficult to eliminate completely because we're all biased to a certain extent towards people, towards things, towards venues, places and cities. How are we going to eradicate that?
Well, that's the whole point. Organizations, I would say 99.99999% of every organization in the world is unconsciously following an eradication strategy. But the problem is that you can't eradicate it, right? It's like the current. Good luck trying to eradicate the current. Good luck trying to eradicate rough waves or heavy weather, right? Yet people sail in those conditions and reach their destination. So how do they do that? The way they do that is by navigating. So what we need to do is adopt a more navigatory approach to tackling the problem of career stifling bias. This idea of getting majority leaders to self-correct, check their biases, do a Harvard test, and see what their biases are and work on removing those is unconsciously trying to eradicate bias. And all it does is reinforce that they're a guilty perpetrator and that minorities and marginalized groups are hapless victims reliant on the goodwill and empathy and awareness of this traditional guilty perpetrator. Both are negative unconscious biases, and they're creating a diversity and exclusion nightmare.
We could be biased and we could even be racists within ourselves, but when it comes to work, we should be objective.
Yes and no. Look, we are all biased. Let's say you're a white middle-class leader, heterosexual middle-class leader, and I'm me, right? A minority ethnic working for you, and you make a decision which is unfavorable towards me, and I think is as a result of your unconscious bias. But I'm wrong. That's a misinterpretation, right? Let's say I get it wrong. What's my misinterpretation based on? It's based on hearsay. It's based on my past experience, and it's based on a wider narrative about the majority. And I shortcut to that, which is my unconscious bias towards you. So now you become the victim, and I become the perpetrator of bias towards you. And my point here is that we all have a propensity for bias, which I think you pointed out. So at any given time, you, if you were my majority leader, could be biased towards me, and I could be biased towards you. The key is when I sense bias or you sense my bias, I think if you don't call it out, then you're giving tacit approval to that bias. So you have to call it out. But the problem is, how do I call out my sensed bias towards me, right, without upsetting you, without getting your back up, without invoking what I describe as defensive fragility, right? Likewise, how do you call me out without getting my back up, without me thinking that you're unsympathetic to the equality cause? So the challenge is we must call it out, but the question is how? And the way to call it out is to engage in what I describe as dispassionate developmental inquiry. That's what I mean by I don't understand.
But then, of course, the perpetrator is always going to deny it. Nobody is going to ever admit that I was unconsciously biased. Or maybe some of the modern managers might.
Yeah, no, yeah. Well, look, you're not going to have much joy if you go around finger pointing and telling people that they're biased towards you. It's just not going to happen for you. So look, the key is working out how do you do that.
Now, I work at a college. They have been proactive in trying to get multicultural people. We've got people
Mm,
from all nationalities working in it, and same with the BBC. That they have their quota, and they try to get people to be presenters and journalists and different jobs.
mm.
So they're trying to be positive, but nevertheless, there could still be a bit of a racial
Yeah.
bias towards or against somebody. Obviously, the companies are trying to do their best, but they can't actually monitor every individual to make sure that they're not racially biased.
Of course they can't. Yeah, no. But what you can do is equip people with skills to navigate the inevitability. The first is to recognize that. Step one, right, is to accept and openly acknowledge the multi-directional nature of bias, of workplace bias. But the problem is the majority don't necessarily want to accept that because they don't want to seem unsympathetic to the equality cause. So they don't say anything. And also, minorities don't want to accept that because they're too caught up in pain and retribution for what has happened historically, or to them historically, or generally historically. We're not accepting that we're all the same. We need to accept that we're all the same, that there is a multi-directional nature. And strategically, that's what organizations do. Once you do that, the minute you do that, I can come on to your next question. I can show you how to call out bias in a way which doesn't invoke defensive fragility, get the other person upset. I can show you. But if you don't accept that, I can't show you. The reason why is you won't allow for your misinterpretation. Sometimes I misinterpret behavior towards me as driven by bias. That's actually my bias. And sometimes the majority could misinterpret my response to them as bias towards them. That's their bias.
Oh, very interesting. That's Buki Mosaku, originally from Nigeria, and has written a book on racial bias, unconscious bias. So unconscious means you don't realize it. You might be, prejudiced against somebody. You might have a bias towards them or against them. But it goes both ways. But you could do this without realizing. That is what he's saying. And then he's come up with these sort of strategies where, especially if you're in a business environment, as to how people could be, equipped to be able to navigate around this biasness. Great story, I thought.
BBC Radio Gloucestershire.